So, good morning everyone. It's time now to continue our study from the book of Revelation. And we're up to the third study, and we continue from Revelation chapter 2 and verse 12 on the 7 churches. And in there we're up to the Pergamos church. And so let's open our Bibles at Revelation 2, verse 12. And to the angel of the church in Pergamos write, These things saith he that has the sharp sword with 2 edges. Now, this is the introduction to this church, and you'll remember that we finished in the year 326, where Constantine gave tolerance to Christianity in the Roman Empire. And now Jesus introduces himself as having the 2-edged sword, which was a sharp sword. So we'll put this on the board. And Jesus has a sharp 2-edged sword. And this sharp 2-edged sword that Jesus has at this time has something to do with the condition that the church was facing when they were given tolerance in the Roman Empire. But more than tolerance, there was a serious beginning of amalgamation between the state and the church. And during the time of Constantine, there was Sunday laws. So, with the state was basically pagan in its outlook on religious things. So most of the pagan worshippers were sun worshippers. And it was Constantine who wanted to bring the 2 groups together, the pagan religion, who were mostly sun worshippers, together with the Christian church. So Constantine wanted to bring paganism and the Christian group together and form a coalition or a binding together of these 2 groups, or amalgamation. And this would give his empire greater strength, he thought. So this was his purpose. So the toleration was given to the church or to leaders in the church at that time. But also in this bringing together was required of the Christians. The Christians were required to compromise. Yes, so they were required to compromise, and this is why Jesus is denoted as having the sharp 2-edged sword. because Jesus did not want his people to compromise. He wanted them to keep the truth. So it was Jesus' will that the Christians hold to the truth. That had been given to them. Now let's read on a bit further. Verse 13. And I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. And thou holdest fast my name, and hast not denied my faith, even in those days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr, which was slain among you where Satan dwells. Okay, so we have this situation which has arisen. And Pergamos means height or elevation. The word Pergamos means elevation. So before this time of Constantine, who claimed conversion, the church was despised. But then when Constantine was supposedly converted, then they were given status in the kingdom. And he used the bishops to support his empire. And so the Christians, instead of being hated, were now recognised. And this caused compromise in many of the Christians who were there. But there was another group who resisted that compromise and held to the truth. And they were the faithful ones. And that's why it says here in verse 13, it says that he knows their works and where you dwell, where Satan's seat is. Because what is Satan's plan? Satan's plan is to amalgamate truth with error. Normally, Satan doesn't just mix or just doesn't keep to error. He mixes it with truth. And even better if he can mix his error with God's truth and God's people, because there's power with God's people. And when he can amalgamate these two things, God's power and God's works, and take over God's church and mix it with a false church, then he has more power. So Satan's not a fool. He knows that there must be some truth in there, or people will just reject it completely. So he got paganism, which had been shown up by Christianity as being a false religion. And he sought to amalgamate that with the church to make a new group, to bind those things together. But there were true Christians who held fast to the truth, and they were called Antipas. Anti meaning against, and the word pas comes from papa, or father, or pope. So they were against the wanting of some bishop or some ruler to rule over them instead of Christ. They were against the rulership of man in the church. Rulership of man over man instead of Christ. They wanted Christ to be their ruler. They wanted their doctrines to be the doctrines of Jesus Christ and not of these bishops who were part of the amalgamation between the state, which was Constantine, and the church, which were these bishops who sought for high positions of authority and positions where they could rule and where they could amass vast estates and vast sums of money by being associated with the Emperor Constantine. And of course, these bishops flattered Constantine. They flattered him. And when he suggested something, they would go along with it. And this way they compromised those who were under their direction, the church. But these faithful ones who were against it, Antipas was not a particular person, it was a group of people, and they became martyrs. So Antipas were martyrs for the truth. They were against this process of man over man in God's place. And Jesus stood with those martyrs at that time. So there was toleration, but only for these type of people who would make compromise. But for those who wouldn't compromise, they were isolated and made martyrs of. So that was the faithful martyr. Verse 14. But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. So here we have another situation introduced, and this is the doctrine of Balaam. Let's put it here. Now, what is this doctrine of Balaam? Well, it tells us something about the doctrine of Balaam in the context here. And the thing that Balaam did is that he sold out his integrity for money. He sold out his integrity for money. He was a true prophet, and he was offered money to curse Israel. And he wanted that money, he wanted that reward so much that he was prepared to compromise himself in order to obtain that money. So Balak wanted him to curse Israel, and Balaam decided to do that. And so he was like these bishops who compromised with Constantine. Well, that is the first thing that he did. But every time he went to curse, instead he blessed Israel, because God overruled in his words, and instead of giving a curse, he gave a blessing. So then he decided to do the curse a different way, and he made a proposal that the Moabite woman would would invite the people of Israel to basically a feast. They would be friendly, and they would talk to them and get to know them a bit. They would have an exchange, seemed harmless. And then there was some feasting went on, and then some alcohol. And then the woman seduced the men. And there was a curse came on God's people because they went in that direction. And in that way, I think it was 24,000 people died in the Israelite camp. They actually brought the woman back with them to their own camp in many cases. And a curse came upon Israel because of this trick. It was a trick. Now, in the same way, back here in the time of Constantine, this same sort of thing happened. The people who followed these bishops were led into a trap, and they were led into a religion which combined something of Christianity with something of sun worship. And that is what happened. And Sunday laws came out of Constantine and the bishops getting together at that time. There were Sunday laws. And these Sunday laws we will see again in the future. Because basically false religion is always coming back to sun worship in some way or another. And it always leads to this. Now, we want to see that sacrificing unto idols was, back then it was literal idols. In the emerging Christian church, I think there was few idols back then, up till this time of Constantine, the Pergamus church. But certainly in the pagan churches was full of idols. And so this amalgamation, the people of God were seduced into idol worship. And then they committed spiritual fornication. In other words, they put a false god, a god of wood and stone, or a picture, or a object, in the place of the true God of the heavens and of the earth, something that God's people have been forbidden to do, to worship an idol, or to worship the sun. Now, attached to sun worship, there was also human sacrifice, traditionally. It always has been. Now, Pergamos, interestingly enough, was the place where the Babylonians who escaped from the Medo-Persian invasion, the leading religious leaders of Babylon, fled to Pergamos and set up their sun worship in Pergamos. So Pergamos was known for sun worship. And as I said earlier, I think the word Pergamos means elevation. That particular church had an opportunity to be corrupted because persecution finished and they were looked upon with favour by Constantine. So that covers that verse, I would say, and then we'll go to verse 14 because we want to get on to Thyatira. But I have a few things against thee because, we're up to 15. So hast thou also them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Repent, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. So we have the doctrine of the Nicolaitans mentioned earlier, and the word Nikolaos, which it is derived from, means Nico, which is subdue or conquer. Subdue or conquer. And the other word laos comes from the word laity. Subdue or conquer the laity. Now the laity are the people in a church. They are the laity. The people who would conquer the laity are the bishops and make the laity follow whatever doctrine that the bishops teach. And this is the spirit that is against Christ. It's the spirit of Antichrist. And that's why these faithful martyrs, Antipas, fought against this doctrine where the bishops would decide on a doctrine and they would amalgamate that with sun worship. And from that the people would be corrupted. And this was even among those who were holding to the truth. It penetrated into the church. So this period takes us from the time of Constantine, roughly 326 to 538. And that was the period of Pergamos. Now what happened in 538? We'll just clear the board a little bit and make some room here. We want to see that in 538 we have the beginning of the Thyatira church, and ultimately it was really the beginning of the papacy. So we have the 1260 years where the papacy ruled. Beginning in 538 and going through to 1798. And we've dealt with this in the studies on Daniel, which hopefully you have listened to. But the church of Thyatira begins in verse 18. We just read verse 16 and 17 first, talking about Pergamos. Repent, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knows, saving him that receives it. Okay, so now we go to the church of Thyatira. And this, as I said, this begins in 538. And that was with the decree of Justinian. So Justinian was the Roman emperor in 538. And he issued a decree which gave the Pope, or a bishop, the leading bishop, power to become a pope. Power to be pope, power to rule. Gave him power to rule in temporal, and in religious areas. Now Justinian was over in this is in Rome. Justinian was over in the opposite side of the empire in Constantinople. And in Rome he gave the Pope that power through the Justinian order, which was a legal document that he made, and that elevated the Pope to a position of rulership in temporal and religious areas, both areas. And so the popes from then on continued this amalgamation of pagan sun worship amalgamated with Christian teachings as well, some Christian teachings. So let's go on now. And unto the angel of the church in Thyatira write, These things saith the Son of God, which hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire. His eyes are like unto a flame of fire. So Jesus is looking into our hearts. At this time, he's looking into our hearts. Back then, he's looking into his church as he's walking up and down in the midst of these golden candlesticks, watching his church, see how it is acting during this time period. And today, he also can look into our lives down to the deepest level of our life. There's nothing that can be hid from him. Verse 19, I know thy works and charity and service and faith and thy patience and thy works, and the last to be more than the first. So he commends them first for their good works. They cared for the poor. They cared for people who were persecuted. They hid people who were running from the persecution which took place during this time. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because you suffer that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants, to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. And I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. Behold, I will cast her into a bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. So, was there a literal woman, Jezebel, prominent in that time? The answer is no. There's no one in history that can be said to be that woman Jezebel during that time period. So we want to see that Jezebel is symbolic. Jezebel's symbolic of the church. A good woman is in a church, a good woman is a good church, and a bad woman is a bad church. And in this case, Jezebel was a bad woman. So let's just look at the story of Jezebel for a few minutes. And we find this in the Old Testament. In 1 Kings chapter 21. 1 Kings chapter 21. And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And Ahab spoke unto Naboth, saying, Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house. And I will give thee for it a better vineyard, or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. And Naboth said unto Ahab, The Lord forbid it me that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. And Ahab came into his house, heavy and displeased, because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he had said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. And he laid him down upon his bed, and turned away his face, and would eat no bread. So the king was very, very unhappy. And while he was so unhappy, his wife Jezebel came and spoke to him. Why is thy spirit so sad that thou eatest no bread? Now verse 6, And he said unto her, Because I spoke unto Naboth the Jezreelite, and said unto him, Give me thy vineyard for money, or else, if it please thee, I will give thee another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give thee my vineyard. And Jezebel his wife said unto him, Dost thou now govern the kingdoms of Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let thy heart be merry. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, and sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters unto the elders, and so the nobles that were in the city dwelling with Naboth. And she wrote in the letters, saying, Proclaim a fast, and set Naboth on high among the people. And set 2 men, sons of Belial, before him, to bear witness against him, saying, Thou dost blaspheme God and the king, and then carry him out and stone him that he may die. So that's what they did. Now we know that in Bible prophecy, a woman represents a church, but maybe we should just confirm that. Let's go to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians and chapter 2, I think it is. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and verse 2. Chapter 11 and verse 2. For I am jealous over you with godly jealousy, for I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. So Paul is speaking to the church, and he says he wants to present the church to Christ like a chaste virgin, purified and clean. So there's another one too, but we won't look at that. We need to move on in these thoughts. So the point here is that Jezebel represented the church, in this case a bad church. So she was a Baal worshipper. Now, Ahab represented the state. Now, Ahab wanted Naboth's land, but the reason that Naboth didn't want to give him the land, because Ahab was going to pay for the land, but the state, which was Ahab, came to Naboth, and Naboth was a man of God. Naboth was a man of God, and his inheritance was tied up in that land. Now, as a Christian, our inheritance is tied up with Jesus Christ. Now, what Ahab was doing was saying, give up your inheritance. But Naboth didn't want to give up his inheritance, because the Lord had said that that land that was divided in Canaan should stay in the hands of the tribe to which it belonged to. And so Naboth couldn't surrender that land without interfering with what God had told them to do. God had told Naboth through the laws of Israel that that land should stay in the tribe of Naboth, and that Ahab had no right to that land. So no matter how much money that Ahab offered, or what good vineyard somewhere else, it was not satisfactory in God's eyes, and therefore not satisfactory in Naboth's eyes, because Naboth didn't want to offend God in any way. So Naboth was in the right, and Ahab and the state was in the wrong. So Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians. So she was a pagan princess who married a Jewish king who was supposed to be a man of God. And this pagan Baal worshipper then told her husband, there was this amalgamation between the two, the church and the state, to destroy, in this case, Naboth. in order to get what they wanted. And Jezebel wrote up for Ahab a false declaration against God's people, in this case Naboth. And in that false declaration, there was a death sentence there if he didn't comply. And they decided to get rid of him. But Ahab, he had the king's seal. Ahab had the king's seal. So, according to their law, Jezebel couldn't just go ahead and get rid of Naboth without the king's seal. So she obtained permission from Ahab to get that seal. And then she used her false prophets to falsely accuse Naboth. And Naboth was put to death, stoned to death. And that is a picture of the spirit that came into the Thyatira church. There is an amalgamation of false religion, pagan sun worship, amalgamated with the state in the papal system. And in that system, the true people of God were persecuted relentlessly throughout that 1260 years, the Great Tribulation, from 538 to 1798. Now, I have a couple of books here. This one's called The Story of the Waldenses, and this was a race of people, partly converts to truth from Peter Waldo, but also they were a race which could trace their lineage back to the time of the apostles. And these people were destroyed by the papal church just as Naboth was. I have another book here. This book is written by Wiley, J.A. Wiley, and it's a very good book. This one is The History of the Reformation of the 16th Century by Merle Daubigny. I've read this book 2 or 3 times. It's a very valuable book. It has 900 pages in it of the history of the Reformation. And it's very comprehensive. It's very interesting to read for a history book. And we should be today aware of these principles, that when the church and the state get together to amalgamate and mix truth with error, that whoever has the real truth in God will be persecuted. Because in this system, there's nobody who's allowed to escape from that system. Now, during this time, we covered this in Daniel, but during this time, 538 to 1798, there were millions and millions of people tortured and put to death, burned in the fires, tortured, etc., etc. We don't want to talk too much about that, but it is a fact that that's what happened. And the papacy was stopped in 1798. It received a deadly wound. So that is that woman Jezebel that it talks about there. It symbolized this church that was operating, called the papacy. And God's people were in that time era. And God gave them special counsel about how to deal with that time period. So now let's go back to verse 20. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because you suffer that woman Jezebel, which calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants, to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. So this fornication was spiritual fornication of leaving Jesus and going over to the sun worship. But there was also true fornication. Many of the papal heads had many wives, and in the Catholic Church there was a lot of licentiousness in the convents and in the various places where they were located. So let's go on. Verse 21, and I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. Behold, I will cast her into a bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. So the church had committed this fornication, which was to do once again with the amalgamation which took place between Constantine, the sun-worshipping churches, and the Christian church, which was going downhill. And this was spiritual fornication. Verse 24, but unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan, as I speak, I will put none other burden, but that you have already have. Hold fast till I come. So there was so much corruption, so many troubles during that terrible time that Jesus didn't give them any more burdens. They had enough burdens to face because they faced death during that time period. And it was only when the Reformation became established in Germany and in England and Switzerland, and then it spread to America, that there was safety, more safety for many of the people during that entire 1260 years. But those who were in Europe, in places like Spain and France and in Italy, there was no let-up of the persecution, hardly at all. And so Jesus said that I won't give you any other burden. And this is the great tribulation that Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 24. And this is the greatest tribulation of any persecuting, that any persecuting power has brought upon God's people throughout history. And it was a terrible, terrible time which lasted well over 1,000 years. So we'll stop there and we'll continue with the next church. Next week we'll try to do 2 more churches next week. So we're up to chapter 3. I'll just read out this last little bit. Verse 26. And he that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations, So the people who are saved from that terrible time, and there'll be lots and lots of them, because there were millions of martyrs, they will have power over the nations. And that is because they will be a part of those who judged them wrongly. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. And I will give him the morning star. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. So Jesus is the morning star, and Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation, the one who made the light to shine bright in England at a very early time, and that's when the Reformation began. So let's be faithful to Jesus. We do not know what lies ahead exactly. We know many things about what lies ahead, but let us be like Naboth, who was faithful to God, and let us not be like those who went along with Jezebel, those who went along with Ahab to break the law of God. Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. So this is what we must do when these trials come. Be faithful to God in the important things, and we render to Caesar faithfully in the things that don't conflict with conscience. So we'll stop there. Thank you.